Mmabatho is going to talk first. She's going to just talk, sort of put the focus around the documentary challenges that we've had. And in 2025, as part of the crisis committee, DFA, Mmabatho and Neil presented the documentary sort of what we want in the guidelines and for the incentives. So Mmabatho is going to present first, and then after her, Emma will go, and we will allow for questions intermittently. So please keep your questions. You can put them in the chat, and then we'll do a couple of, after every sort of 5 slides, we'll do 3 or 4 questions. So I'd like to welcome Mmabatho Montsho. She was previously a board member of DFA last year. She's an award-winning writer, director, and visual artist who explores themes of justice and liberation on an intimate human scale. During her time, she also represented DFA at SASFED for 12 months when she was a board member, and she contributed to the sector-wide advocacy efforts. As part of her role, she's a member of the team that conducted a survey on the DFA's members and the DTIC crisis. The findings from this research helped the DFA contribute towards the fit-for-purpose DTIC guidelines for documentary filmmaking. Okay, over to you, Mmabatho.
Okay, so as Carolyn already mentioned, I was one of the SASFED reps with Neil as my complementary last year. And by the time we had joined SASFED, there had been already sort of efforts from the different organizations in the sector that were engaging the DTIC on the ongoing crisis that many of us already know about right now. At that point, we conducted a survey with DFA members to get a sense of what was happening from the documentary side of things. And we got about 19 people that responded to the survey. Many of the responses came from Gauteng, and a lot of the respondents said they had not actually applied to the incentive in the last. We had set the survey to go back to 2018, but in the last 5 years, a lot of people hadn't applied to the incentive due to confusion, not understanding how it works, and also feeling despondent because of the heavy requirements from the smaller companies. That survey we used to kind of speak to the issues that we thought could help a sector fit for purpose guidelines for documentary, and responded to some of the specific clauses within the guidelines from the DTIC. In one of the responses that the DTIC had sent to the different organizations, to the collective organizations that had sent through a list of demands, one of the questions from that response was, why do we want a fit-for-purpose documentary incentive? Because according to them, the current guidelines already cater for documentary. And the department wanted to understand the business case for a separate documentary filmmakers incentive and the funding applications to operationalize it. We spoke to how documentary is actually a living sort of project, which doesn't work the same way as fiction does. We respond to real world events in real time that if we don't capture, they're lost. And this is part of an important archiving of history, especially from a South African perspective, where historically we may not always have had access to documenting our own history in real time. So the act of documenting itself is time sensitive, with many works serving to archive living history for future generations. Going to the actual guidelines, I just need to minimize this. Going to the actual guidelines, some of the clauses that we spoke to I've written here and what our recommendations were. So clause 4.1.3 says the applicant must complete and submit an application prior to the commencement of the project anywhere in the world. Sorry, someone speaking? Okay. If the project commences prior to receiving an outcome from the DTIC, the applicant would have done so at their own risk, and so on. You can read the rest of the clause. And then 4.1.7, prior to commencing with principal photography, the applicant must have secured 100% of the budget following the grant awarding decision by the DTIC, and such proof must be submitted. Clause 4.3, the principal photography must not commence until notification letter approval from the letter has been received. In our response, we tried to sensitize the DTIC to the fact that, as mentioned earlier, documentary is a different beast from fiction, and we work with real-time events that can't be sort of neatly packaged into pre-production, production, and post-production. So we proposed a revised application model for documentaries that allows for filmmakers to apply for the incentive after principal photography has begun, to kind of respond to the needs of real-time events. So that research, development, trailers, promos, archive, and all of that are all eligible for the qualifying spend. On provision that all principal photography is documented and logged. All production and financial records are audit ready. No major post-production has started before, meaning some kind of post-production may start because we know that we need that in order to make sure that the story is making sense and also to get funding. A clear finance plan for remaining phases is submitted, and all other incentive criteria are met. And then the 25% that's required to be in the bank is replaced with an escrow model where a third neutral party holds the money until full financing is secured. That way the filmmaker is not required to have 100% of the money before they can proceed. This approach recognizes that the unique documentary model where filming, rough cuts are often needed to secure funding, unlike traditional scripted projects. It would also ensure that auditing integrity is preserved, full verification through standard audits. The risk to the DTIC is mitigated since incentives will only be paid after the audit claims and final delivery, and filmmakers are not penalized for capturing urgent and historically significant events. There are international precedents that we can look to that support this approach, and this model will align with what South African documentary filmmakers need at the moment, and also give us the leverage to participate in documenting what's happening not only in South Africa, but in the world. We've already spoken about this, that traditional production models that define research and then development and then production and then post-production in sequential stages doesn't necessarily work for documentary filmmaking. And we outlined the reasons why and how documentary filmmaking works. The next clause that was problematic was the final claim after production company, and SPCV should be accompanied by audited financial statements. The final claim must be submitted to the DTIC within 24 months from receiving an approval decision from the DTIC. We asked for this time to be extended so that the window is 36 to 48 months. Asked for that time to be extended to 3 to 4 years to accommodate the time that we need to do the kind of work that we do. And in the process, also introduce an application for extension in the process. The next clause was 5.2.1.1, which required that at least 60% of principal photography must be filmed in South Africa. We required that this be reduced to 30%, once again, because of the nature of the work we do. Say, for example, you are telling the story of somebody who lived in exile, or you're telling the story of a refugee. It might not be possible to do principal photography 60% in South Africa. So we used some of their own guidelines to speak to say, reduce it to 30%, provided that we meet all these other requirements that are already in the guidelines, which is the majority of the intellectual property must be owned by South African citizens and the copyright must be registered here. The right director must be South African. The top writer and producers must be South African. The majority of the highest paid performers must be South African. The majority of the heads of departments and key personnel must be citizens, and so on. Also speaking to the important transformation goals that we have as a country and also as a sector. So adhering to how many Black South African filmmakers are there, as well as the gender question. The next clause was about disbursement, which speaks to the defined milestones that we already discussed earlier. And we proposed that instead of the 20, 20, 20, and 40, it be split into 25% 4 times, with approval of incentive submission Form B to include a production booklet, call sheets, confirmation of interviewees, and key characters. The next one is completion of photography. This should include shooting logs, location report, signed release forms, rough cut, assembly, edit, demonstrating that substantive principal photography has been complete, with the understanding that due to the nature of documentary, we might have to go back and reshoot some stuff or do additional shoots. Completion of post-production here speaks to fine cut and post-production deliverables, with the understanding that we would have maybe had some earlier rough cuts to help us raise more money. And then final delivery and audit completion, final audit, copyright registration, film and publication board classifications, and so on. The next clause was 9.2, which said these are the non-qualifying costs, which included development costs and story rights. For documentary, this is absolutely crucial, and we recommended that it should be eligible for qualifying. So research and development, which we know is ongoing as new information occurs, especially if you're following things like court cases, war, and so on. And then the final recommendations were around the communication of the DTIC. So we recommended that they significantly improve their recommendation with applicants by implementing structured response and protocols. Some of the people in the survey responded that they did apply and they didn't get even a rejection. There was just no response at all, which demoralizes a lot of people. To digitize the entire system via an online platform, urgently create online application and claim portals with clear guidelines, real-time updates, help desk support, escalation procedures, and a clear closing of applications when funding is unavailable, so that there's no uncertainty there. And for them to make a bit more of an effort to share information through explanatory videos, regular seminars, tours, and so on. And to send bi-weekly updates and guarantee responses to emails within 72 hours, so that people know what's going on. The submission itself is about 10 pages long, and I'm sure the board will be open to making it available to anyone who wants to scrutinize it and probably add to it. Some of the things that I haven't put here on the slide include how they should look at distribution for documentary, that it's not always a commercial project, and sometimes education is a big factor, and that will be distributed very differently to how they expect fiction to be distributed, just to keep those sort of things in mind. But yeah, all of that stuff is in is in the longer document, which would take quite a long time to go through here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mmabatho. I just want to check if anyone has a question before we go into Emma. A few questions, small questions, Mark. Unmute yourself, ask the question.
Doing that, yeah. Great. So just basically the concern about the escrow account. So currently the Black Filmmakers Incentive only has a 10% requirement. So I'm not altogether convinced that the escrow account in its essence will necessarily resolve the problems. The other thing is about the milestone claims, the proposal of moving to 25, 25, 25, 25. In my experience, the DTIC has not in the past, and that might change when they revise the incentive, has not had the capacity to manage that effectively. And so they tended to want to do the first 3 milestones in one go. That obviously presents a cash flow problem around the production. So because you're having to loan or get money up front, and even if it's documentary, the same reality would apply. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. And then the definition of completion of principal photography could be problematic, I would think, because it's a subjective thing in this respect. If you have a bond or you have a clear completion of principle where it's locked and it's pre-decided, it's easy. But if you are afterwards going back and you're saying, well, I want to get more, more post-production money, you've now had a pre-approved incentive. So to go and increase your budget after the fact would be detrimental to the objective of a pre-approval process. And Mmabatho mentioned the idea of having a sort of a full audit after the fact. The reality is that at every milestone you have to do an audit. So and the DTIC expects that. So that places a significant obligation on the documentary producer in order to make that happen. The idea that development and story costs should be eligible, I firmly support, and I think we should argue that beyond the documentary sector, because it's been extremely problematic, and I think the Writers Guild and others should take it up as well, because it's extremely detrimental to the way in which films are made now, whether they're fiction or factual films. And documentary, certainly it's an absolute essential. So absolutely agree with that. Yeah, that was my observations on it.
Yeah, look, I think the big issue, whether it's documentaries, okay, or the Black scheme or the South African scheme or the co-production scheme, in the co-production, the South African scheme, you have to have 25% when you apply, and the Black scheme 10. Now, let's say your documentary is 5 million, means you have to have 500,000. Now, you've got an investor, and they're not going to trust you with 500,000 when the finance hasn't been closed. So that rule that was introduced, I think it was in 2023, that rule was introduced, and it's one rule that we've been fighting against both as DFA and as IPO, so that that can be done away with, because they won't allow you to put it in an escrow account, and they won't allow you to put it with the bonder. It's got to be in your account. And it just allows for a lot of abuse to happen down the line. It's not a good idea at the end of the day. You give us back the 3 months, and in that time we've closed the finance and we put it in. If we haven't closed the finance in 3 years, 3 months, and you know that you can't start shooting anyway. And that's something we're going to discuss later, because you can see in the the cancellation of the documentary, there seems to be a huge amount of documentaries that have been approved but cancelled. And is it due to the fact that they didn't raise their money in the end, or is it due to audit? It's unclear from the documentation we got from DTI. So does anyone else have a question or a comment for Mmabatho? Otherwise, we can move on to Emma.
Before we move on
Yes.
to Emma to address some of the issues that Mark is raising, I think
Yes.
it's something that we've spoken about even at the AGM as an organization, that
Mm.
wider participation will make the process a lot more robust. And it is something that I think we must continue to request from the members, that just in general, out of 250 people, if only 19 have responded, there's only so much, that can be representative. So going forward, especially because the conversation is alive now, to kind of inspire members to participate more in shaping things going forward. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Carolyn.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so thank you very much, Mmabatho. Okay, we have Emma now, who's based in London. Emma actually is a South African, so it's fantastic that she did the economic assessment. Emma Openshaw joined Olsberg in 2021. What does SPI stand for? Sorry.
Strategy. Oh, you've put me on the spot here.
Okay,
It
don't worry. Don't worry.
no,
Okay.
but it's strategy, priority, and impact, or we're changing it now to incentivization. It's a bit of a moving target, but yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll just say Olsberg.
That's
So
perfect.
Emma Openshaw joined Olsberg in 2021 as a senior research analyst working across the firm's global portfolio, and was a project manager for the South African Film and Television Incentive, the economic impact study, and best practices in the incentive design. Emma brings extensive hand-on production experience, which has strengthened her major projects, including Create England's local economic impact toolkit and the capacity assessment for screen sector in Maine and North Carolina. She has contributed to workforce and skills development initiatives, notably a crew mapping and skills forecast for BFI. Emma's international projects she worked along, including analyzing global performance of the Dutch Fund for the Netherlands Film Fund, assessing the economic impact of Fiji's screen industry, and supporting multiple assessments across the Gulf and Africa. Before joining Olsberg, Emma started her career in South Africa in the production sector. She served as a broadcast director and senior partner at Wild Earth Safari Live, delivering daily live shows and series for National Geographic, SABC, CGTN, and previously worked as a production manager at Mannequin Pictures. She holds an MBA from the University of Oxford and a degree in screen production from the University of Cape Town. So let me just go. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Olsberg so people can understand who you work for as well.
Perfect.
So Olsberg was commissioned by the IPO to last year, I think around August, to do an economic assessment of the DTI film incentive because of what was happening with the collapse of it. And basically, Olsberg is the international company that assesses film tax credits and film incentives globally. I don't know how long they've been. They were formed in 1992, but they're an international creative industry consultancy that specializes in global screen sectors, providing independent strategic insight and advice to drive sustainable growth across the sector to both public and private clients. Since 1992, they've been the leading international consultancy in the sector, which includes film, television, video games, and digital media. Their work includes developing and assessing national strategies, public policy, including production incentives, providing an analysis in areas like workforce and skills development, studio provisions, conducting economic impact. Their expert independent advice is trusted and has been a proven track record to create a high level of new and repeated businesses for a diverse group of companies and organizations. These include, but not limited to, subnational governments, established studios, streamers, facilities, content inventors, film commissions, and training and skills development organization. Okay, that was quite a mouthful, but you can see they the people to go to when you need to. So I just need to just to proviso before we get into your presentation, just that Olsberg was commissioned to do an economic assessment. Now they will have recommendations at the end. Of course, those recommendations will have to go through Parliament and through the DTIC. So they can only make recommendations. They haven't created the policy, nor have they implemented the policy. So really, in presenting today her report, it's really for us as DFA to take that information so that we can become the advocates to get what we want. So over to you, Emma. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Carolyn. Hopefully everyone can see that. So yes, that was a great introduction. So I really don't have to do much of that on that case, but thank you so much for having me. It is great to chat about this report, which has been a bit of a baby of mine at Olsberg SPI, because I'm obviously incredibly committed to the South African industry, even though I'm slightly further away now. But we're very proud that we've been able to kind of push this through, and that is largely attributed to the industry itself. So I'll talk through kind of the processes and the approach we went through to get the study off the ground and how we actually got this data. But there are a few people on the call who helped us along the way. So we thank most of the industry for actually pushing forward and providing us the data, or else this wouldn't have been possible. So I'm going to take you through this quite quickly, but if there are any immediate questions, please pop them into the chat. Carolyn will kind of feed them through if I don't spot them first. But we want to make this as interactive and discursive as physically possible. I'm going to take you through what the study was. As Carolyn mentioned, it is an economic impact assessment. So there was a laundry list that we kind of looked at with the IPO when we originally were commissioned. Obviously, there was a lot of concern going around in terms of the incentive. There's also a lot of other elements to consider in terms of how the ecosystem of the industry is working at the moment. We narrowed it down to the fact that there was no existing current data on the actual value of the incentive that, as an industry, you could rely on, and that wasn't being directly kind of kept or packaged by the DTIC, which a lot of their data is aggregated and communicated in a way that didn't really match what the industry was giving feedback on. So I'll take you through kind of what the actual mandate was of the study and how we got there, and also a bit more about SPI just in general and kind of where our expertise come from to inform this kind of work. Then I'll get into the nitty-gritty of the economic impact assessment, so talk you through the methodology. Due to the nature of South Africa and the data available, as well as the nuances of the industry, this was quite a bespoke economic impact analysis for us. So we had to really shift how we do certain metrics to meet the needs of the industry and to kind of meet the data where it was sitting for us. We'll go into a couple of key findings that were also informed by engagements and consultations with the industry. So we did some qualitative work where myself and my colleague Nneka, who unfortunately can't be with us today, were on the ground in South Africa and walked through a lot of the issues with the incentive that were, I think, largely public knowledge, but really trying to piece together a picture. And then we'll talk about the kind of wider impacts, which is a micro impact analysis that we do as part of economic impact analyses to look at how the actual production expenditure within a sector behaves. And it's a thing that I think is quite inherent to a lot of filmmakers, but when you're speaking to policy or government or even national stakeholders, private investors, they don't quite see it that way. So we find it's a very useful tool to communicate how valuable production spend can be within a region, city, country, so on and so forth. And then we'll get into the recommendations. So recommendations is a bit of a loaded term here. In terms of the economic impact assessment, we really wanted to focus on the findings and use it as ammunition that could be taken forward to develop the argument for a discussion of to how the incentive needs to be in the near immediate future. The main part of this recommendations is us as an independent body who have global expertise saying that South Africa does and should have a production incentive that should be functional and transparent. That was kind of the key recommendation that we wanted to drive across with this, because that pairs with the data. And that was the key piece. The rest of the recommendations are more considerations for next steps. So from our expertise in incentive design, as well as guidance for other policies and governments, we've put forward a lot of kind of high level information regarding incentives, incentive structures, and what should be considered moving forward within the South African context. So this was very much outlined by Carolyn, so I won't go into this too much, but if you'd like any more information on who we are as a firm, There is a QR code there. We do a range of works in terms of across different sectors of the industry, across different formats. We've done a lot of work recently in terms of independent film, especially in terms of the UK. We informed a lot of the work that went into the introduction of the independent tax credit that came into play in the UK in the last couple of years. We've also done work across the World Bank through the IFC, and we work with industry studios such as Netflix, Amazon, as well as your traditional HBOs, Warner, and so on and so forth. So that is us. We can definitely talk a bit more about like our expertise and, you know, what kind of information we brought forward from the other work we do. As I mentioned, we do a lot of incentive design work. So we recently launched an incentive that we worked with the Qatari Film Commission on. We worked very closely with the Spain Film Commission on their recent initiative in terms of introducing / redesigning their incentive system. And we've just been in Greece recently as well, which is actually quite a comparative case to what's going on in South Africa. So as much as it is difficult to hear, the situation with the incentive in South Africa is unfortunately not unique. There are a few jurisdictions experiencing some issues where the value of the incentive and the worthwhile impact it has in terms of a wider economy is very difficult when you don't understand how the industry actually works. So it's good for us in that we do a lot of work there, but it's also it's a common problem. Great. So let's get into it. So the study itself. So the study was an economic impact assessment, as I mentioned, of the country's incentive program. So the incentive program is distributed by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, but they were not directly involved in the study in the case of a study partner. We did consult with them and we did try to access data, which we'll chat about in a bit more detail later on. We evaluated all 4 incentive streams. So originally we weren't going to include the co-production incentive stream within this study, simply because a co-production incentive does rely on other additional elements that are slightly different from the other 3 incentive streams, being treaties, relationships with other jurisdictions, the dynamic of storytelling across. There's a lot of elements that are normally considered with that, but the co-production incentive is incredibly valuable, and South Africa is a very unique jurisdiction in that it has quite a lot of co-production treaties. So we felt that it was necessary to kind of build in. And then, as I mentioned to you, the microeconomic impact analysis, this includes a ripple analysis, which I'll show you a visual of. And then we did the high-level outline of strategic recommendations, as well as a review of incentive best practices and reference case studies. So these reference case studies, being Abu Dhabi, Australia, Hungary, and Ireland, we felt were comparative for various different reasons. They have a lot of learnings that I think we can pull from in terms of moving forward with South Africa's production incentive, that we can chat a bit more about if anyone has any specific questions about how those operate and what their relevance is. Great. So let's get into the economics. So I understand, obviously, with documentary, in terms of our experience with this project, often what we would do is we would divide the value, well, sometimes we would divide the value by formats, being scripted, non-scripted, or documentary, feature film, television series, so on and so forth. Because of the level of data necessary for that kind of evaluation, that was not our key point with this economic impact assessment. So what we did was aggregated all productions. What I can tell you from the data is that it did include documentaries. So we just took all of the incentive applications, approvals and non-approvals that went through from 2015 to 2025. So this does include documentaries, but documentaries is not specifically pulled out. However, we'll chat a bit more about the trends and the key findings from the economic impact assessment that can inform how that is going to directly impact a production format like a documentary. In terms of the incentive itself, as was previously mentioned, a lot of interaction with this incentive may not be the case with a lot of members within the DFA. So to just kind of take you on a brief overview of the incentive. So there's the 4 streams. There's the foreign film and TV stream, which includes a post-production incentive. This is specifically geared towards production servicing. So that's focused on international investment, international productions coming in, filming in South Africa. You have the South African Film and Television Production Incentive, which is geared towards South African productions. This can occasionally be utilized in a case of if you have, for example, a Netflix hyper original, well, that is technically an international commission. If it's done in a case of it meets the requirements of a South African film and television production incentive, that's where that rebate can be applicable. You have the South African Black Filmmakers Incentive, which used to be called the Emerging Black Filmmakers Incentive. This is specifically targeted at emerging Black filmmakers and now existing Black filmmakers to basically introduce an element of transformation that was very targeted in terms of the incentive scheme. And we'll chat more about how that element of including that incentive stream hasn't exactly translated in terms of that transformation goal, considering how it's utilized. And then we have the co-production incentive stream, which is geared towards specifically co-productions. So what we have here is kind of a breakdown of how that works. We have qualifying South African expenditure. Qualifying South African expenditure, for those of you who don't know, is basically the amount of your budget that is eligible for an incentive. So you work off that qualifying production and expenditure. What we can do is we can go back to this and kind of walk through any key questions. In my past life, I used the incentive, so I can speak to my experience having used the incentive during its time when it was pretty functional, and we can speak to kind of our interactions and our usages of incentives in the rest of the world. Great. So now back to the report. So our report uses a standard best practice approach to economic impact. So this is the process that we go through with all of our economic impact analyses. And what this does is basically it breaks down all the inputs that we require, so production and or incentive data. When we're doing incentive economic impact evaluation, we specifically need not only the production data, we also need what was applied for, what was qualifying spend, how much was approved, how much was paid in the end. As you all know, the auditing process can have a significant impact on what the final claim amount is and the final payout amount is. We also use economic data, which are national statistics, as well as OECD information, which is basically statistic data based on a national level that evaluates how an industry within a country operates. So that is publicly accessible data that we tap into and we use to build out our model. And then we use additionality. So additionality is something that I think speaks to what Mmabatho was speaking about earlier, and that we normally send out a survey with additionality. So this is very much sent out to producers, filmmakers, any members of industry that have engaged with applying for incentive. And we request information on how likely they would have been to film in that region had the incentive not been a consideration or had the incentive not come through for their production. And that normally shows us kind of the additional value of the incentive. With this, we did have quite a low response rate, which in itself is a supportive finding to the industry experiencing a significant level of fatigue. We're seeing this internationally, but it was especially acute in South Africa, as I think a lot of industry had provided extensive amounts of data previously, and it hadn't really come to fruition. And you guys have been going through a lot of claims in terms of the DTIC. So this level of additionality, what we did was basically take what we had as well as use qualitative data from the industry engagements we had and merge that together and scale it up from our previous work that we've done in and around the region, basically. So then those inputs go into a model, which we build out specifically to suit that project, and then we get our three outputs, which are direct, indirect, and induced economic impacts. With regards to the various levels of economic impact results, you have direct, which is the direct exchange of spend. You have indirect, which has to do with a larger supply chain, and then you have induced, which is a consequential spend. So in non-highly economic terms, basically what that does is measure spend not only in just your direct exchange of costs and production expenditure, but also across how that money actually cycles through the economy. And then that comes down to basically our GVA, which is gross value added, which is similar to GDP when that's used quite often. So that's really the overall collective value of the input of the incentive versus what you're getting out into the economy. You have employment numbers, employee compensation, as well as your return on investment, which is the direct result that you get from R1 spent from the incentive to the actual economic value of the incentive, which we'll get into the results after that. Now, going to the data point, we worked with the IPO. They had submitted a PIRE request at the beginning of last year. From the DTIC, we received the data from the DTIC. Unfortunately, the data wasn't nuanced enough for us, and it was quite aggregated, so we couldn't actually pull the level of detail that we required to get the model built out and to get accurate numbers from that data. So we went out to industry and requested that level of data from production companies. From what we had with the DTIC, as well as I mentioned previous work that we had done in the region, we identified the hit list of productions we'd need that made up the majority of the usage of the incentive, and that came to around about 10 to 12 production companies. We got 13 production companies to send us through data, which we were incredibly pleased with, and all of their confidential data was then gathered and sorted and fed into our model. So that was basically how we went upon the economics of it. In terms of the qualitative data that I mentioned, we chatted to 26 individuals as well as select focus groups to build out a bit of a story as to exactly what was going on with the incentive, and then we could match the economic trends with those more narrative pieces. Great, so these are the results. So I'm going to take you through them top to tail. If anyone would like to discuss it in detail, we can definitely pause after this for a bit of a question.
Yeah.
There are
I was going to say, so I think after this one, let's pause. Anybody has a question, either put your hand up or put the question in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, and also I know this can be quite, even if you've read the report, it is quite robust and quite heavy in terms of economics. But the value of that is that it can be used to really quantify exactly how valuable the incentive is. And that was really the key takeaway of this work, is that the incentive does have a significant impact, which speaks to this return on investment number, which I'm just going to jump to the bottom. So the return on investment number, which was averaged over the 10-year period, is 5.1. So that means for every R1 that was invested through the incentive, 5.1 in gross value added went back into the economy. That is a very strong ROI for most comparable regions. We don't often compare GVA ROIs across regions just because there's so many different dynamics that feed into how a market operates. But in the sense of kind of that global industry, this is a very strong return for an incentive. You can see there that basically over the time, 26.4 billion Rand was averaged out in terms of gross value added generating around the economy, employee compensation 13.9 billion, and then annual employment, which is 6,600 persons on average per year. So this is asterisked and it's caveated quite heavily. I know people have had quite a lot of responses to this number because there are a lot higher numbers that I think have been put around the industry. What we had to do for this number is we weren't able to use national statistics numbers to feed in, which we normally would to get to a full-time equivalent number. So in our other economic impact assessments, we normally calculate employees by full-time equivalents. So basically what that means is because the industry is made up of a freelance basis, you want to attach each person across a year. So you look at a full-time equivalent as opposed to individual roles, because then you avoid double counting basically. Because of the lack of level data for the industry from national statistics, we then use a per person count. So this normally attributes to a role or an account of a person per year. This is also averaged over the years. It peaked in 2022 at 13,400. That was kind of the peak and the peak of the incentive, and then it dropped down on average because of the drop in the incentive functionality beyond 2022. So we can chat a bit more about that, but I think it is important to note that that number is heavily caveated, but it is still a strong number, especially in terms of the rest of the numbers over the course of those 10 years. Great. I'm going to pop it onto these findings.
Let's pause and see if anyone has a question.
Yeah.
Would like to ask Emma? Lindy says it's extremely strong considering 10 years ago it was 1.9. So that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Kati, would you like to ask your question?
My question would be around the how the money was collected from, just to confirm this idea that the monies collected for the rebate was from the fiscus that collected taxes from our sector per se. How we could just confirm that, because that was my understanding, that this rebate money was a part of what was collected from our entire industry and then reinvested as a rebate. Because, I mean, for me, that was like one of the things that I wanted to sort of keep on explaining to the individuals that worked at the DTIC, where often there was a feeling like we were stealing the money and going like, no, we actually contributed this money to the fiscus already. Now we're just taking a part of it and reinvesting it, So that's a question. How does one track that it's tax money from the fiscus collected from our industry?
I mean, I can jump in here. So I think in terms of that, it is often a very difficult narrative to explain, especially when you're looking at something. The incentive should be kind of the blue chip because it operates from the DTIC, which is an economic department. So in theory, the budget for the incentive comes from the overall part of treasury, which is specifically allocated to beneficial high to medium to high performing economic sectors. So that's why you have it alongside automotive. I think there's still a textiles one, and there's a couple of others. And the idea is, yes, in theory, the money that kind of is generated economically, not only taxes, but additional spend throughout the economy is then filtered back within Treasury and then trickles down to those kind of key performing sectors. I think it's something that we struggle with a lot, and that it is a specific struggle with the DTIC, and what we've tried to do a lot, which I know can ruffle a lot of feathers in terms of the industry, is refer to the sector specifically as a sector. So if nothing else, it is almost like a manufacturing sector. There is an input, there is a product at the end, and there is a process in between that creates jobs, that creates cultural value, and that creates economic input outside of just taxes. So the measurement of taxes in terms of that input of the incentive is valuable, but this number of the 5.1 is not just the tax value, it's also that additional economic value that is generated off the back of the incentive. So I think, Cassie, it is also a noble job to have to try and convince people that what is being put into the industry, what is being put into the economy by the industry is inherently needed back. But yeah, there are definitely a lot of nuances there that I'd be happy to provide more information if you ever have to go into that debate again. But hopefully this does the job for you guys. Of basically saying, listen, this is how much money you're actually getting into the economy off the back of spending R1 out of an incentive.
But also, Emma, from the prior documents that IPO were able to access from DTI through, through the Access to Information Act.
Yeah.
If you look at from the one that I've seen from 2016 to 2025, 4 billion was dispersed in total to the industry. 4 billion, I'll tell you now exactly what it says. 4 billion, 64,120, 108, whatever. So, so if one was to say that the film industry generated, as in the GVA, the gross value added of 26 billion, and they paid out to 4 billion of that over the 10 years, that's 26 divided by 4. I mean, that's only 6%. They've paid us 6.6% to the industry. So it's not like they've actually given us a huge amount. They could have given us much more.
They could have, but unfortunately that calculation is a very specific calculation in terms of if we're providing this amount, you should be giving us this much amount back. In terms of the payouts, it's also what is documented as a payout is spread over multiple years and multiple different applications. So this is what we struggled with the prior request data. is that there is a level of data, data that's per year in terms of applicants. We found that a lot of that was all new applicants' data. You didn't have historical data of outstanding or second, third, fourth tranches. You also had a bit of a lack of connection between what was applied for and what was actually paid out and the reasoning behind that in terms of audits and that kind of thing. So on the one side of your question in terms of what's listed on the PIA data in terms of that's what was paid out in terms of claims versus what is actually documented in that data, that's normally why we need to really have such nuanced data to be able to adequately say in a year, even though this amount was paid out, this amount attributes to these 5 productions that happened the year before, these new applications, as well as these outstanding historical pieces of data, which if you go even bigger, I know there is a much wider conversation about the kind of annual reports and how the competent liability didn't match up to the actual outstanding claims. And that in itself is also an additional other conversation that doesn't fit within the value of the incentive, which is what we did in this report. But in terms of that point of view saying, if it's 5.1.
So can I just can I just ask you, in terms of international norms, if you look at Ireland or Abu Dhabi, or you had Hungary and then Australia, what percentage would normally be given back to the industry based on what they generate? Is there a norm of a percentage?
In short, no, because that's normally not how it's measured. It's very much the incentive is measured off of the economic value of that industry. So yes, the amount that it gives back, but then the economic value in turn with other industries and sectors. So because it's a incentivized mechanism, it's based off of the budgetary allowances of that government and of that treasury. So Australia, for instance, they have very robust annual reporting and very detailed reporting in terms of how much their industry is making and how much their industry is contributing in terms of economic impact. However, the way they measure the incentive is based off of a percentage of how that industry is behaving in comparison or aligned with other industries within the sector. So the incentive isn't linked to how much an industry is putting in. It's linked to the value in the stack of chains of industry. So that's why you're seeing in Abu Dhabi, Saudi, for instance, Qatar, which we recently worked at, and they've introduced an incentive. There's a desire to include incentives to really support these industries that are not your traditional mining, coal, and oils, because they have a lot more sustainability and they have a lot more growth potential over a long period of time in terms of not only your economic input and your financial contributions, but also your jobs, your employment, your cultural value, and so on and so forth. So that's how it's measured. It's not a direct, this industry produces X, thus we will give them 5% of that, sadly.
Okay. So Enver, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, hi everyone. So I was wondering, are the figures inclusive of the sector that we're specializing in? Are they including documentary?
Yes. So we do have documentary numbers within this. Obviously, as mentioned, there is really not a lot of documentaries that went through the incentive process, which is a fault of the incentives accessibility more than anything else. So that is definitely a conversation to be had. And I think if we had access to a lot more level data / if we are to do this again, I would definitely say there is a need to include that format specific breakdown within kind of that evaluation, because that would highlight that underutilization by documentary.
Can I follow up?
Yeah,
sure.
Is there a documentary that you can say successfully uses this incentive as a model for us? I mean, I can think of like Octopus Teacher, but I'm not sure about its use of the incentive. But is there one that stands out for you that can serve as an example?
I'd have to probably throw it to the members just because our data was incredibly confidential. But if there is anyone on the call that was able to access successfully the incentive, I'm guessing it was probably before 2023. But is there anyone who has used the incentive
Yeah,
successfully?
I got paid out in 2024 on Music Is My Life, Joseph Shabalala and Ladysmith Black Mambazo. I also used it for Nelson Mandela, The Myth and Me. I used it
Yeah.
for from Underground to Corridors of Power, on the history of NUM. I've used it 4 times for documentaries. 3 were
And I
co-productions and 1 was a South African.
and I've also used
Yeah.
it as well. Yeah, I used it for a French Canadian South African co-production, Five Roads to Freedom, and it worked, and we did
Yeah,
get the rebate. Yeah.
And I suppose kind of throwing the question back at the two of you, it sounds like a lot of those occasions were co-productions. So if anything, you were using it because of the co-production and less because you wouldn't have done it if it was a straight documentary, possibly.
Sure. No, that's true.
No, I did. From Corridors to Underground of Power was a South
Right.
African documentary, 100% funded out of here. I did use it for that as well. The only
But
thing is
it's
that the interesting thing with Music Is My Life, because we got funding from the KZN Film Commission, and KZN doesn't recoup their documentary spend. When they came to pay us out, they deducted the KZN amount. So we lost about 700,000 in the end on the payout. So that's one of the problems with the NFF recoups their investment, but KZN doesn't for documentaries. So one must be aware when you're working out your finance plan that your DTI is going to pay you less if you have KZN in there.
I must say in
It's
our
double
case it
dipping.
worked. Yeah, sure. I must say in our case it all worked out very well, and the money came through and the film went well and it worked. But that was a while ago. That was quite a long time ago, you know.
And I mean, it was between, South Africa was revered as the blue chip of production incentives up until, especially between 2020 and 2022, from an
Yeah.
international perspective, as well as in terms of those who were using it locally,
Yeah.
used it quite well. And I think this is also an issue that we find in quite a lot of other regions, especially Greece. We found it in Fiji recently, Romania, where an incentive does function incredibly well. It benefits industry. Unfortunately, the organization doesn't do enough to keep that knowledge sharing going on and ensure that new producers are in the know. And then you have this carryover of bad habits. You have this overutilization of certain production incentive elements, in this case streams, as opposed to the use of others. And then you have this imbalance occur and you have an industry that gets quite dependent on the incentive. I think in terms of documentary, South Africa has an incredibly strong documentary base. But it's a base that I think, like a couple of other bases, and now like a lot of other scripted production companies that have emerged over the last 3 to 2 years, especially just before COVID and after COVID, you have people not even wanting to touch the incentive because why would they? Because they've always had to work around not being able to access it. So I think what we're definitely trying to do here is prove the value of it, but also say, there's a lot of room for improvement and growth because an incentive shouldn't be a band-aid. This is a lot of the work we kind of struggle with, especially I think the DTIC has often been found to give feedback that, the industry's fine, it doesn't need an incentive, so it should operate without. And that's not the purpose of an incentive. An incentive is to support growth and support sustained growth over a long period of time. And going back to kind of that comparison, the automotive industry still requires an incentive, and there's never a question of, okay, well, it's fine once they get off their feet, we'll take it away from them. It's an economic mechanism that ensures that an industry that is profitable and is contributing successfully to an economy sustains that. So yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, Emma, with the documentaries, if I didn't get my 40%, I would never have been able to make those films. So
Yeah.
I absolutely needed them because, as we know, documentaries are very hard to do pre-sales on. And particularly in South Africa, there's so limited amount of people you can go to for funding. So the incentive is absolutely imperative for us. And
Definitely.
also the last incentive that that the last payout, it took me 3 years to get paid out in 2022, which obviously impacted my cash flow and the interest that I owed. So it wasn't great because that you end up with having to pay extra interest. Okay, Mark has a question. Can he comment on the annual employment used on the doc?
Please do, Mark.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm only going on the basis of that problematic document that the DTIC sent under the PIA report.
Yes.
Which if we look, they're two different job totals. They're both slightly different.
Yeah.
But it's clear that they're gleaning that data from what we as producers have been submitting to the DTIC over years. And we, on the whole, have only been reporting on payroll, in other words, direct figures.
Yeah.
And if we take their figure against your direct figure in your, you've totaled it at 6,600, but that includes indirect and induced.
Yeah.
And if we only take the direct, you're showing in your detailed in the document 2.6, which compares a lot lower than the DTIC's figure, where I've annualized it and it's coming in at between 4.9
I think it's like 4 and 5.
The one is on the jobs. It shows 4.1, and on the other one it shows 4.956. So depending on which table you use, it's giving you different results annualized, but those are both higher than what you're showing. So I'm not sure what data you actually used in terms of providing for the direct and indirect figures on that table. That's what I'm querying.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a very valid question that we struggled with because we did use that PIA data as a bit of a sense check. We also used the unpublished interim findings from the DDAT work that had been done before us as a sense check. And then the employment figures were the only figures that differed quite significantly, as you've pointed out. The issue we had is that the level of the national statistics data, we couldn't in our model get our inputs from the production data with those national statistics employment numbers from the wider, broader creative audiovisual sector to get anywhere close to those DTIC numbers reasonably within our model. And because we couldn't do the full-time equivalent measurement, it unfortunately hindered us a bit with that. So this is a very, very conservative viewpoint on employment. This is a guaranteed, there are this many heads in the sector, which I agree with, I think is problematic in terms of, I know a lot of the numbers are significantly higher that have been thrown around, which is completely valid. I think in terms of we would require an actual skills mapping and a more nuanced level of information also about the wider sector. This is only incentivized jobs, I think, as well, which obviously the DTIC data is also. But we really struggled to backtrack those two numbers in the DTIC data to any tangible number that we could kind of hang our hats on as an organization and say, listen, we back this number, we understand where it came from. And because of the concerns around, job numbers, I think especially we wanted to err on the side of conservative. So that's kind of why we stuck with this number without scaling it up. But we have tried to caveat as much as possible. I know a lot of industry is very concerned because obviously job numbers are a big lever when you're trying to motivate it in terms of industry. Especially in terms of the job sector. But I think in terms of this number, this is still a relatively good number for the year on year. So like the 13,000 for 2022 is a reasonably good number for a total for a year. But then unfortunately, the average is significantly brought down by those consequential 3 years. So we've used it more to motivate the fact that the functionality of the incentive heavily impacts the amount of jobs that an incentive can support, basically. And that's kind of what we'd like. But obviously, we're acutely aware that it's a concerning number for you guys.
Yeah, and
it's
it's
good with
interesting
you.
because I don't know, Mark, what's the total figure for the film and television industry? Because this is just on the incentive. Are we talking 20,000 people, 50,000 people with the actors, everybody, you know, the whole sector? I don't know what the total figure is for employment across.
Well, I think the issue is here that it's not really shown as full-time
Yeah.
what's it equivalent jobs. It's shown as
Hours.
a no,
Hourly.
it's shown
Uh,
as positions basically the
Yeah.
way I'm seeing it. Am I right?
Yeah.
You've basically seen it as positions rather than as, and you said these positions are busy throughout the year on this basis.
Yeah.
And so that's the calculation which you've used, where they've used a full-time equivalent jobs basis based upon actual hours, which we as producers have been submitting to them, which theoretically only they can summate.
Yeah.
It would be impossible for Emma to have done that in the absence of every single producer having supplied the same data to them.
Yeah, so I think ideally, I think in an ideal world, when we do this work, we do have quite an open comms with the administrative body for the incentive, and then you can get access to those levels of hours data, which is when the FTEs come in. Carolyn, I can see you saying something, but you're muted.
Okay, Aletta had one question. Aletta, I mean, would you like to ask your question about your methodology, etc.?
Yes, thanks, Karen, and thanks, Emma. I'm just speaking on behalf of South African academic researchers also. You mentioned that this is the kind of study that really should be replicated at a later stage. So I was wondering if you'd be willing to share your, sampling, your methods, uh, yeah, those kind of things, so we can actually replicate it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously from an organization perspective, we'd love to just be hired again to do something more like this. But I think in what we've said to everyone and what we've kept quite open when we presented this at the Joburg Film Festival is that we're not just here as a kind of a drop-in consultancy to say, here is a report. Okay, we'll see you in 10 years when everything falls again. We'd love to kind of advise on any future, strategic work in terms of how you set up these metrics. So I think I'll use this as an opportunity to quickly click over to this next slide, but we'll go back one. One of our biggest pieces here, which was brought up in terms of your guys' requirements for the DTIC, was the fact that data capturing and data reporting is just not where it should be in terms of how the industry operates, in terms of the level that the industry operates at. And that is where a lot of these issues are coming in, and that is that, none of this data is actually captured and reported accurately and adequately. That is also a mandate of the NFEF to some degree. So, it's a broader conversation and we engage with them quite a bit in terms of this work of how do they come to the table in terms of, their last report was 2021 in terms of the industry, and that should be their organization in terms of comparisons throughout the wider global sector, do annual reports to be able to give you the numbers that you need to take to government regularly. The same as the DTIC, they don't have a digitalized system, which is one of the biggest falling points for this incentive when it does get functioning again. So I think in terms of if we'd be willing to share that, of course, we'd be happy to kind of engage with any next entity on doing this work of, how we best advise they move forward, what kind of insights we have from our internal work that we can share. It's, we're really big on kind of sticking around, which is, my company has no choice because I'm gonna make sure we keep involved in the conversation. So yeah. To that extent, I think more work needs to be done, and of course we'd love to do it, but we also would love to just be at a table helping whoever needs it in terms of pushing it forward.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Nneka, and I work for the South African Cultural Observatory. We do a biannual mapping study of the sector, because I think it was Mark who asked a question of the overall employment that the sector does contribute to the SA employment figures. So that's the figure that the domain, which is audiovisuals and interactive media created in 2024, the last quarter of 2024. So we do a biannual mapping study, and it also contributed 19.8% to the overall 271 billion rands that the sector, the CSIs contributed to the SA GDP, which is about 4% of the overall SA GDP. I'll share the study shortly on the chat.
Tim, I must just quickly say that our economist raves about your guys' report. So just as a little point there, they are incredibly helpful and very detailed. So yeah, definitely worth sharing if more people are interested in it.
Okay, now thank you. We'll share it shortly now. Yeah.
So sorry, does that include the 4% of GDP? Does that include cultural, creative, and sports? Or is it just arts? Is it just film and TV and media?
The figure for film and media, wait, let me do it for you now. For that domain is it's around 53 billion rands towards the SA GDP. 53 billion towards the SA GDP. Yes.
And that's, I think you guys allocate that as audio visual, so it's film, TV, post, documentaries, unscripted and scripted,
Yeah. And what percentage is that of the GDP? What percentage is that of the GDP? The 53 billion?
The overall contribution towards the whole entire SA GDP is around 4%. However, if you are looking at only the CCI GDP per domain, they contribute 19.8%, which is around 53 billion.
Okay. And we in par with agriculture and what other sector? Tourism? No, tourism is higher than us, hey?
Actually, we are above. If you're looking at agriculture, that is just the crops. They contribute around 2.something%, which is roughly 160 something billion. But if now you include agro process, then they then jump to over 200 billion. But if you're just looking at crops only, then we are above them. We were on par with them in 2020, but now we've overtaken them. If you're just looking at crops, because they recorded 160 something billion last year, in December 2025, when they released their report.
Okay, Jane, we'll come to your question because Emma's going to talk to the future of the recommendations, and she can talk to whether South Africa can regain its credibility in terms of the rebate.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's carry on then, Emma, with your next slides. Thank
you. Fab. So yeah, thank you guys. Those are all really great questions, and I think definitely a worthwhile discussion in terms of this. I'm going to run through this relatively quickly, but just kind of refresh that these were the initial findings that were based off the economics, so that are kind of in the full report, and then enforced by the qualitative work that we did in terms of engaging with industry. So as we've spoken about, the ROI is very competitive. It's competitive in terms of other international sectors. It's also competitive in terms of sectors within South Africa. So we, in our reports, as I've mentioned, don't often include those kind of comparisons. But if you take recent work, especially in terms of the industries that are supported by incentives within the DTIC, a 5.1 ROI is very competitive. In terms of the foreign film and TV production and post, that is the incentive that is used predominantly and has kind of the highest usage, and it occupies the most utility of the incentive programs across all 4 streams. With this in mind, and considering the level of treaties that South Africa has, we found that the South African co-production incentive is incredibly underutilized. There's a lot more potential to utilize that stream. And then in terms of the South African production incentive, basically both localized incentives, the production incentive and the Black Filmmakers incentive, they're not utilized to their full potential at all, which really they're still contributing a significant level of value in terms of an incentive stream, but comparatively to the foreign film and TV, post incentive, it's just not really performing in a way that is as valuable as it possibly could be. And this is across various reasons why it's at this level. Obviously, we focus on the economics here, but from qualitative information and from our experiences and speaking to people and working with the incentive myself, this very much has to do with the functionality, the accessibility of the incentive, as well as the general knowledge sharing around the incentives applications and its own issues with the actual operational side of the incentive. So in terms of having spoken about future work that should be done, that is a big piece that would need to be considered, which is basically that functionality and operational value of the incentive and where exactly that has tracked and where it needs to go in terms of it to operate successfully and efficiently. And then, as we've mentioned, there's no formalized strategy or structure in terms of digital capability. This is speaking specifically to the DTIC. Obviously, we know that there was the announcement a few years ago now that they were introducing a digital system, and when we spoke to them, they mentioned that that is still ongoing. But that is one of the key issues in terms of the operational lack of efficiency with the incentive process at this point. And it trickles out in terms of what we've spoken about now with data and data capturing, and how that can really be relatively improved. And yes, that is very much on a national scope of things, but I think this is something that can also be brought down to an industry level. I think with opportunities like this, across the different formats, you have an opportunity to share ways in which data can be collected from an individual perspective for a company that makes it beneficial for you companies to work out their own, expenditure ROI and how they're contributing specifically. I know work is done in terms of tax impacts across PAYE with some production companies. So I think there is a lot of opportunity to better utilize and gather data across South Africa, across the South African industry for sure. Great. Okay. So
Emma, maybe I'd be interested to know from members who would like to share their experience of they've had around trying to access it and they weren't able to, and what was the reason for not being able to access, whether it was the Black scheme or the South African scheme or the co-production scheme. Because people just from the survey, there were different people expressed different, they thought you had to have 500,000 already, in the bank before you can apply, etc., etc. So just be interested to hear from members if anybody's willing to share their experience or their frustration of trying to apply for any of the schemes.
Carolyn, I can just read some of the responses in the survey if that helps.
Yeah, that
while
helps.
people think
Just
about
so that you can understand why is it underutilized.
Yeah.
Okay, projects were always below the minimum budget threshold. Believed that I needed 500,000 in the business before applying. Discouraged from applying as documentary funding is seen as a waste of time and not profitable. Previous negative experiences. DTIC framework does not align with documentary production realities. Assumed the incentive was only for fiction. Do not fully understand how the incentive operates. What else? Okay, applied for documentary supplies that application must happen before filming. Yeah.
And I mean, speaking to a lot of these findings, I think it's something that we find a lot when we're doing now incentive design or we're called into existing incentives to review why they're not functioning adequately and what can be done. I mean, in terms of defined formats, it's just not as easy as it was 10 years ago in terms of setting up an incentive, and you had scripted, unscripted, and even then you didn't really have VFX, but it was kind of a cut and dry, here's an incentive, great, this is how a production works, fantastic. And often they were drawn up in policy by departments who weren't familiar with how productions work. And that's when it becomes so key to have advocates and representation that collectively are representing an industry. And I think that's something that came through and speaks to kind of the side that we have up now, but really came through with the engagement with industry is there are, I think, various organizations fighting for their formats because they're underrepresented and they're not getting, through to the powers that be in terms of policy, especially in terms of the DTIC, for instance. And it's having a bit of a siloed effect in that whoever shouts loudest kind of gets heard, and then it's 2 years down the line, and it's a phenomenon that we're seeing across many industries, and that it's becoming a bit of a fragmented situation. And you really see the struggle when there isn't a body that is wholly representing an industry in a effective way. And I think we use Australia. I mean, the UK is the example globally. We always get asked about the incentive in the UK, and that is predominantly because you have the British Film Institute and you have the British Film Commission, who have collectively worked over the past 2 decades to ensure that government are super pro the sector. And there is representation from every format, from every subsector of the sector feeding in. And that goes beyond, it goes documentary, it's immersive, it's short form now, it's micro content, it's post-production, it's VFX, there's so many, it's writers, it's the development side of things, it's distribution, it's exhibition. There's so many levels that now have to be considered within an incentive, and this is very key in terms of this slide, balanced. Kind of, you have to really have it balanced against a wider ecosystem of financing. And I think that's something that we really wanted to drive home in our recommendations, is that the collapse of the incentive has, if nothing else, exposed the lack of structure and the problems with provision for financing across South Africa for filmmaking, no matter what format. But I think it is particularly worse for documentary filmmaking, especially. I don't think I have to tell you guys that, but it is something that we really wanted to kind of drive home, is there's this issue, especially now, even further highlighted by your multi-choice Canal Plus deal, the collapse of Showmax, kind of the lack of availability of negotiation power for filmmakers to be able to get funding, and the lack of trust from the private sector because they used to bank on the reliability of the incentive. And I mean, that even extends to the IDC. The IDC hasn't backed anything, I think, for quite a few years for the last couple of years, because they used to rely solely on the liability of the incentive. So yeah, that's not surprising to hear.
Yeah, I think, Emma, I mean, you've raised a number of very critical points, but I think one of the biggest things, that introduction of the minimum required when you apply, is a major stumbling block for a lot of producers now to be able to get people to give them money up front until all the finance is closed. So that was only introduced 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And the person who introduced it actually didn't quite understand the value chain in terms of production and, reaching your strike price before, and with your bond and etc. So they just randomly put it in there, not understanding the ramifications, which are very, very serious.
Yeah.
And obviously, SASFED is our body that represents the South African film and television industry, but the NFF has to play a much more critical role in this sector in terms of engaging with DTIC and IDC, etc., which they haven't really done, to be honest, because they fall under the Department of Arts and Culture. So somehow because of their statutory requirements, they don't seem to be able to engage with the DTI in the way that they should be engaging as a film and TV sector. For people to understand, so for documentaries in the South African scheme, for documentaries, the qualifying spend should be at least 500,000. So if that's 40%, you times it to get whatever your budget would be, which would be approximately 2.5 million, and then you'd get 500,000 back. So it doesn't mean that that your budget that you have to have 500,000 in order to apply. That's what you can get back as a minimum. Obviously, you can get higher amounts. It can go up to, the cap is 25 million, but the minimum is 500,000.
Yeah, and I think that kind of that piece of information and that knowledge sharing opportunity is really important, especially when the incentive gets back up and running functionally it's part of this conversation, and it's also part of that kind of teaching of how that documentaries can and should access the incentive, but how do you make it accessible for documentaries for sure. So yeah, I mean,
Mark, sorry, what are you saying about also important, the core sector ecosystem? What are you saying?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say the ecosystem slide that, and also in the presentation that Olsberg's put together, that we're looking at the moment on the screen. It's the recoupable nature of many of the funders has not been listed in both documents. And I think it's important to note that when the NFEF gives money towards a DTIC incentive project, they expect it back, so it becomes recoupable. The same thing with NEF hasn't really been functional in the last while at all.
yeah.
Unfortunately, as has IDC, as you pointed out, but GFC is, I think, the only one who doesn't do it. KwaZulu-Natal also expects their money back on DTIC incentive projects because otherwise it's double dipping. And you've mentioned it under Eastern Cape, but you haven't mentioned it under the others, which is why I just thought I'd mention it because I see it is inconsistent in terms of the way it's presented there.
Yeah, and that's a good shout, Mark. I think that's definitely something that we'll look at adding into this, because I think it is key to outline how these finance structures actually function in turn with the DTIC, or in the case of kind of that recoupment. I think for this purpose, we really outlined it as this is what the ecosystem is. It's not very robust enough to kind of take the hit of of not having an incentive there. And I definitely think there is space to do a significant amount of more work in terms of this finance piece and the financial ecosystem piece, because I mean, even speaking about, documentaries there, we didn't even look at, the grant ecosystem and that side of things, and bridge financing options, which aren't extensive, but also kind of your more pre-sales deals and that kind of thing. And I think that is very valuable and should really be pictured. And that's we did struggle because we wanted to do that work, but it just wasn't within the scope of this project. But I think that would be, in terms of Alette's point, a great academic piece that should be done in terms of really scoping out what that ecosystem looks like. And it could be, for the case of just documentary filmmakers, listen, this is what you have access to, and these are where the pitfalls are, to your point, what's recoupable, what's not. And we've been speaking a lot, I think, when we have these conversations, a lot of people often say, okay, well, but Europe functions so well and the UK functions so well. And the reason Europe specifically functions so well with things like documentary and independent films is because they have a hell of a lot of money going across a wide ecosystem. So they have film funds, they have grants, they have national funding, they have regional funding. It's very stackable. And I think we kind of bring that up in terms of our recommendations of there's an opportunity for a lot of these players on this slide to look at that kind of stackability in terms of incentives and in terms of national funding. So as opposed to that recoup process, there's more opportunity to actually make divide the funding in terms of making it stackable and making it applicable to undervalued regions, cultural, not cultural tests, but more kind of cultural contributions, uplifts, that kind of thing.
Just to add to that, these core ecosystem funding system people who you're showing on this page are all ultimately government money.
Yeah.
So and it's interesting because how does that stack up to your other territories that you've looked at? Is that the same reality elsewhere? Is it unusual?
It's not unusual. I think this is quite usual in terms of what we term emerging to developing markets. I think it's what tends to happen is you have a lot of national money split across to try to build lots of different elements of the production ecosystem quickly. So we see that a lot in kind of your more emerging. So this is quite often the case in most South American regions. It's happened a fair amount across Asia where there are incentives in place. But in comparison to kind of, at this point, I think South Africa exists in a very interesting space in that term, kind of emerging, developing. It is a very high growth industry and it's grown substantially over the last decade. and has the potential for growth to be in that developed category relatively soon, if it continued on the trajectory it was in your 2020, 2023 space. But without those more kind of complex additions to the financial structure, primarily one being private investment, which is, through loans of banks, which is one of the biggest struggles of the South African ecosystem, is that you can't get a loan through a bank for the film sector, which is, I think, a bug for many of the industry to bear. The industry has been solely reliant on incentive, national money from some other area to often bridge the gap to the incentive, and then their own equity, and then pre-sales. So it's, I think it's not unusual, but considering where South Africa is as a market, this area should have matured as quickly as the industry matured, if that makes sense.
But the difference also, Emma, like CNC in France, or BFI, or the Island Film Fund, the Island Screen Island, they've got a big, big kitty of money, whereas NFF has a very small kitty. And yes, our minister promised us on Saturday night at the SAFTAs, he's going to give us so much money to help us to build the industry. Well, let's see. But the base we start on is a very low base. And people don't, they think we just arts and culture. They don't see us as a business. So why do we need money? Even though we can generate, in terms of the youth unemployment here, we can generate huge amount of employment for young people in the country, and everybody's into media, whether they're on their phone 24/7 or something, they're involved. So, Europe, obviously, because the European Union, they have all their national funds, their regional funds, European Union funds. So in Europe, they can make films without ever having to do a return on investment. It's very easy for them. But whereas in the UK, obviously BFI now is trying to help the independent sector with a 50% rebate on a 15 million pound film or below. So there's always the tax, ultimately it's coming through the tax system, and we have to also convince our tax, like SARS and Treasury, that we can create huge growth in this country if they give us a very simple 35% back, and we can do it, like we put our VAT in, we get it back. We don't have to make it all complicated. We spend 2 years having to do this audit, which is completely, and now they want to audit more and more. There's always something changing all the time, always shifting the goalposts. So it's just very, very difficult, because as independent producers, small producers, we don't have the money that the foreign service companies have. They can hire 10 auditors to do what they have to do, and we can't. 2 years later, they want you to come back and back and back with more information when you've already given it to them. So it's very, very frustrating. Okay, we've only got 20 minutes left. So maybe I'd really like you to, because people have got the report, I'd really like you to expand on the recommendations, particularly around the film incentive, the tax credit, and the tax shelter. I know that they're recommendations, and I know that they haven't been accepted in South Africa, but just to understand how they work, just the basic, because when you read it, it's very complicated. What is a tax shelter? It's just becomes very complicated. So can you just explain it to us in very simple terms?
Yeah, sure. So I would recommend everyone go back and have a look at the pretty little diagram that I quickly went past, just because it is a very valuable asset in terms of how a production actually spreads out its value. And to Carolyn, your point, it shows, I'm quickly going to show just because I'm going to be cheeky. What it does show is it shows the value of a production expenditure across different sectors. So to your point of saying that a lot of people think that film and TV are just arts and culture, this shows the economic value across multiple different sectors, which you all know, but sometimes is very difficult to translate. So if you ever need that, I highly recommend using these. We have them across various different projects and reports. There's 2 in this report. And then in terms of the recommendations, so as Carolyn mentioned, we felt it necessary to add into this report. So because it was an economic assessment, it was purely just about the numbers, but we felt it was imperative considering the state of the sector at the moment and the impact that the lack of functionality from the incentive has had on that situation within the sector. These are our key areas of recommendations for what needs to immediately happen. And we worked a lot with the IPO in terms of their hearing for the government as well. And we will continue to work with them in terms of trying to aid in the conversation of what's next, and then what's in the next 6 months, what's in the next year, and then what's in the next 5 to 10 years, because that's really how things need to be looked at this stage. This is very much immediate address. So within the report, there's a review of different incentive models. So there's the cash rebate, which is what South Africa currently sits on, which is an immediate application and transfer of cash. So you show your budget, you apply for a certain amount, and as Carolyn said, you get a percentage of that qualifying spend back per your production. You then have a tax credit, which is one of the more prominent examples of an incentive. So this is part of this is Australia's credit, it's the UK's model, and this is it's similar to a cash rebate in the way that it can be immediately refunded cash based off of a production's expense, depending on the level of liability. Or it can be a transferable tax credit, and that's more of a transferable and non-transferable tax credit system. And that's when you can actually take the credit that you have acquired from the entity, which in South Africa's case would be SARS, and you can either sell it to the private sector directly. So that is that's a model that is used relatively widely, has been used not that much now, because it does require a very high level of engagement from the private sector. Or you have the Hungarian model, which is kind of revered as the transferable tax credit model, which they have a film fund that goes out and purchases these, basically engages private sector to buy out these credits, which in turn puts money into a pot, which the industry can then access that money from. So the fund runs that tax credit. And then you have a tax shelter, which works traditionally as the term works, in which you basically offshoot your expenses elsewhere. So in terms of this example, what we've said specifically for South Africa is that a cash rebate has worked and was a blue chip for a reason, and that it had a relatively immediate payout, and it also didn't require a level of administration that a tax credit requires. So often what happens is when you have a tax credit, you do have to have, so in the UK, for example, HMRC is involved, you'd have to have SARS involved. Because the incentive solely sits as a cash rebate under the Department of Trade and Industry, it's used as an economic mechanism, and that means people can apply and immediately get cash back. So that's very advantageous, especially 10 years ago or more than 10 years ago, when the incentive was introduced and the industry was nascent, and it was a way to really get people going and utilizing the incentive in a really high functional way. The problem is as we've seen, when you have compliance issues and issues with functionality, that can become a very easy system to manipulate. But for now, because it's the way the industry works and it's the way the industry operates and it's accepted under the Department of Trade and Industry, which again is economic and not under the Department of Arts and Culture, which I think is a key definition, and that's preferably you would not want an incentive to move to the Department of Arts and Culture, is that it would be an immediate relaunch of the existing system with certain things that we've mentioned in here. So your digitalization of the system, your heightened level of communication, your inclusion of advocacy from industry through the working groups, as well as that kind of shared basis of what the industry needs next. There's a lot of question as well in terms of the cap. So the cap was reduced to 25, originally it was 50, as well as kind of increasing the rate. All of those conversations should happen. However, basically getting the incentive back to functionality is the key point. And I think Jane raised it earlier of can South Africa get back to a reliable state? And the answer is yes. I mean, people have done a lot worse and made it back. You have quite a few examples. So with Fiji, where we worked after they had introduced 40 to
Sorry, where's CG? You said CG, Emma?
Fiji.
Oh, Fiji.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fiji.
Yeah.
So Fiji had a 40 to 60% cash rebate that they introduced quite a few years ago. It was highly oversubscribed, as you can imagine, and they overcommitted and basically found themselves in a significant amount of debt. they closed down the incentive, spent 3 years paying it off, and have subsequently spent the last couple of years rebuilding trust with the industry, which has gone incredibly well in terms of they fostered relationships back with Survivor's film. They're now going on, I think, 8 years, 2 seasons a year, and that's that's the kind of repeat business that you can only dream of in terms of an incentive. Romania is the other side of the coin. It is functioning again now, but that's only as of late. So Romania's incentive was heavily oversubscribed. They found themselves in debt with quite a lot of big players in the industry. And there was promises to pay back, and the money has never, from our accounts, not been fully paid back, but it's been settled. So now they've opened up another application window, which obviously most producers are quite wary of. So you have a lot of these issues in terms of functionality of an incentive and going too big too quick. So right now, considering the situation that the industry finds itself in South Africa, the biggest recommendation is to reintroduce the incentive with an adequate budget to sustain it for one application window at the very least. And during that time, be able to have these conversations. I think our biggest concern is that the new budgetary year will open and there won't be an opportunity to open an incentive window for another year, which then puts everyone in the industry back yet another year. So that's where we stand in terms of the incentive. As I said, we don't recommend at this stage any one specific structure. There are many different options. We've laid it out in terms of the report, and I recommend you kind of go into the detail. There's also an intensive description of what the differences are and what the pros and cons are in terms of what you'd require with tax credits, transferable tax credits. One of the biggest would be any shift would involve SARS. And from our initial kind of understanding from industry is that getting SARS on board for that would be quite a long-term project. And if you got SARS on board, that means SARS would be involved in the auditing process, which would then require production companies to be compliant to that level, which presents its own problems in certain circumstances. So that's kind of a very brief, quick summary of all the incentive models. And that's what we put as section 1, which is kind of the key focus. And then section 2 very much speaks to that wider industry piece and what Mark's spoken about in terms of that wider ecosystem and the financial structures, as well as national training programs, standardizing data collection, strengthening plans to retain and attract workforce, as well as kind of formalizing this relationship between your different organizations from SASFED and the NFEF down to organizations such as yourselves in terms of those representations, how they work and how they feed into the broader system of the DTIC.
So thank you, Emma. There's a question from Lindy. Would you like to ask your question, Lindy?
I'll put this up for you.
Yeah, just unmute.
Am I on mute? No.
No, I said unmute, yeah. Emma, you can stop sharing, thanks.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I just wanted to just get clarity on one of the recommendation when you say formalizing. What do you mean by formalizing working relations between the film agencies? Are you talking about industry film agencies or film commissions? Because in my understanding, that was formalized.
Yes.
NFEF and the film commissions, provincial film commissions.
Yeah, so I think basically in terms of our recommendation, it was the formalization between those national film agencies in terms of those provincial film agencies alongside your industry film agencies. So while we understand that the national and provincial agencies are formalized in terms of their communications, what we did find during our qualitative work is that there aren't as many opportunities being utilized for knowledge sharing, as well as kind of that opportunity to engage with what the next opportunities they are working on. So I think especially this came up across the Western Cape and Gauteng specifically. So there are a lot of conversations about regional incentives and where regional incentives may have value and how that can kind of be pushed up to the DTIC as a recommendation. And in our engagement with them, we found that there is definitely more opportunity to better engage with industry organizations such as yourself, such as the IPO, in a way that is a lot more formal and a lot more structured and a lot more continuous, and not just based off these kind of reactive engagements, but basically looking very much more into the future of having that consistent engagement across not only your national and provincial film agencies, but also your industry on quite a balanced level.
So basically a combination of government established organizations with industry organizations, because that's two separate categories.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it was kind of, we were lucky in terms of it came out with the Save SA film, that there has been a lot of that engagement, I think specifically on the Gauteng side. And that's almost a bit of a beta test for how there are opportunities to utilize those communications across those national, provincial entities and your industry entities in a way that is meaningful and creates those partnerships that can then better inform conversations with the DTIC. Because I think often what you have is you have so many steps that those steps get missed along the way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I still think NFVF is the body that can be able to lead this kind of conversations.
Yeah, no, it's
Definitely.
critical. It's our national body. It's got to be lobbied, and they've got to get involved in this, because they haven't been, and it's been one of the biggest problems.
Yeah.
Pascal, you have a question for Emma?
Yeah, thanks. I wrote it in a text. I just wanted to know if there were any recommendations made for, as far as government is concerned, for the national broadcaster, the SABC, to play a more supportive and co-financing role, especially as documentaries are, in other regions that have incentives, are heavily reliant on broadcasters, especially public broadcasters, because they're not commercial ventures per se, and so since it's going to Parliament, they should also be speaking to the national broadcaster to support documentary. I mean, it's critical, I think.
100%. Pascal, I think it's a very fair point, and Ontario really comes to mind in terms of what you're talking about with that. The ideal example, especially in terms of documentaries, with the national broadcasters, the government, and kind of the national and more provincial side of funding alongside documentaries, especially. I think we mentioned the SABC in terms of kind of the context of the industry, but we don't speak to them at all in terms of them as a financing body, because at this point, unfortunately, we couldn't warrant putting them in as a financing body that is a viable, immediate remedy or kind of feed in, which I think in itself is an issue. We did some work, as I mentioned, for the World Bank the previous year, and outlined a much more robust ecosystem structure in which we detailed kind of how the SABC's kind of functionality as a national broadcaster does seriously inhibit a lot of these, and does seriously highlight a lot of these issues now that the incentive has fallen. I think even more so you felt the impact of the incentive because of the lack of support from the SABC, and I think that has then even been further emphasized by the multi-choice dynamic. So I think all in all, that is quite a pertinent piece of work / discussion that needs to be had in quite a serious way, owing to the fact that, multi-choice has even further amplified this as an issue. Unfortunately, the SABC was just too big of a topic for us to touch in terms of this being specifically to do with the incentive. It's super important, and 100% agree and appreciate that. That is a piece of feedback.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, the Department of Communication last year was issuing a white paper on how to financing model for SABC. I haven't seen it, so let's see what they're going to come up with. I mean, when we had a conference last year at around the industry, they were more interested in the DOC and how they could amortize TikTok for people in South Africa and make money from TikTok, as opposed to really be without a public broadcaster for 10 years now. It's been bankrupt since 2016. There's just no place for people to raise money, let alone to get a platform. So without SABC, you know, the industry, it has to be solved. It's very, very, very important that it gets solved sooner than later. But
Definitely.
what I wanted to ask you, you had one of your recommendations, you said create a national training program for production companies. What are you
Yes.
saying to that? What are you talking to there?
So in terms of that, that very much has to do with I know I've said it quite a lot in terms of that knowledge sharing piece, but there was a level, we talk a lot about kind of the different tiers of production companies. So you have your entry level up to kind of your advanced commercialized production level company, and then your production services companies and so on and so forth. We talk a lot to that career trajectory across production companies. And what we find is there is a lot of gap for training, especially in markets like South Africa, when you go from your kind of new entrants up to that commercialization stage. And there are a lot of production companies in South Africa. Granted, the fall of the incentive has knocked quite a few of those, which is obviously in itself incredibly tragic. But there is definitely, I think, a need for that, a collective initiative to really focus on how you upskill production companies who are at that entry level to even medium success stage up to that level of commercialization and financial stability stage. So that is very much based on work that we do, and we do that work even across Europe, where we see the same issue, where there's kind of this, when you have a functional incentive that's incredibly viable, like you have over the last, at the beginning of the decade, you have a lot of production companies open up and a lot of people going into the industry. And what you need that structure to be able to take them from entry level production company through to viable, financially compatible, and not saying that they need to go up to a production service level, but to that same level of commercially viable as a production services company, which speaks back to your point about there being, five kind of big players predominantly across the production services side of things. And that isn't inherently a bad thing in terms of the ecosystem, but it needs to be addressed in a way of saying, okay, you can have production companies that service the industry in multiple different ways, and they need to be as equally financially viable.
Yeah, because if I look, the reason I'm asking that, because if I look at the data, the statistical analysis from DTIC in 2016, 2017, there were 5 documentaries that were cancelled that were worth 13 million, 2 under the black scheme and 2 under the co-production scheme. And the DTIC paid out 7 million to 2 to the black scheme and 2 to the co-production scheme. So for me, that's a huge amount of money. There was another year, I can't remember, 2019, I think, they cancelled 27 million for documentaries in total. So is the question, is it about people applying and then they don't shoot in time, so they cancel because they didn't go ahead with the production? Or is it when they submit their final claim on compliance, they're being penalized and therefore they aren't being paid out? And as I said earlier, for small companies, they don't have an endless pot of money to be able to do audit after audit after audit. And so for it's really important for the transformation of this industry that the DTIC allows for people to be able to work, to work with them to make sure that they don't get penalized. Because 27 million of cancellation and 13 million is astronomical for documentaries. I don't understand what happened and why that happened. Because as you say, the data, it's just figures. They don't give you all the information. So it's hard to deduct what is the reason.
And this is not the only reason, but one very simple thing in terms of, in hindsight, being able to track this is if it was a digital system, you could go back and see what happened with those applications, and you'd be able to actually track why, and quite a few schemes do this. They track why certain applications weren't successful, and you then spot trends as to the fact that there were, an excess of documentary applications that weren't successful, you'd be able to go back and say, okay, well, it's because A, documentary producers are not applying in the correct way. B, we're not prioritizing these applications in time so that we're missing their photography stages. And you can identify those and correct them. But with the lack of structure in terms of that tracking and that evaluation, you're kind of left exactly where we all are, kind of asking why those things happened. And yeah, I think that to me is the quickest and easiest answer, is that there needs to stop being that that ability to track and monitor that kind of thing so that you can call it out, because the process of telling people that they need to come and resubmit the documents via fax or through a drop-off to somewhere in Johannesburg is a bit absurd.
No, okay, we've reached the end of our time, so we have to thank you, Emma, for taking the time and for I was waiting for months and months for your report. I was like, when are we going to get it? And thank you for doing such a comprehensive report. And I do hope in the long term that the powers that be will implement your recommendations. And obviously, as the DFA, we've got a hell of a lot of work to do to lobby and advocate, for advocacy, and to make sure that we get the system that works for us, and that we can make films and that we can access the rebate, because it's not they always say, oh, we should be thankful. It's taxpayers' money. We've paid the taxes. We have the right to it, and we have a dynamic industry that's very, very important in both telling the truth as we are today with the world, and also in making sure that our culture and our history and our heritage is always reflected and is put out to the world. So thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate it. And to everyone else, have a good night.